Good morning. The inquiry completed the oral hearings for Module 3, Healthcare Systems, in December 2024, and work has already started in earnest on drafting my report and recommendations for Module 3. Today we begin the first set of hearings for 2025, and it will be a very busy year. First, we have the module that we begin today on vaccines and therapeutics. That will be followed by modules dealing with procurement, test and trace, the care sector, children and young people, and the economic response. As each set of hearings conclude, work begins in earnest on drafting the report for that module and any findings and recommendations I make. So for the inquiry, 2025 will involve 6 sets of hearings and the drafting of reports for modules 2 to 9. So we have a great deal of work to do to fulfil my terms of reference. Beginning vaccines and therapeutics today, we would normally begin with an impact film. For reasons entirely beyond the control of the inquiry, the film needs last-minute editing. Work has already started on that, and as soon as it's ready, it will be played, and that should be later today. I'm sorry for the delay. It is not the fault of the inquiry, I wish to emphasise, and I know that there'll be many people here and possibly following online who are anxious to see it, but we will play it today, so I'm sorry for the delay. At this stage then, instead of playing the impact film, I'll call on Mr. Hugo Keith, King's Counsel to the inquiry, to set out the issues that this module will be investigating. Mr. Keith.
My lady, as with all statutory inquiries under the Inquiries Act 2005, this inquiry, your inquiry, is bound by and must address the issues and matters identified in the terms of reference to which you have referred already. Included in your terms of reference is the obligation to consider and report upon the response of the health and care sector across the United Kingdom, including the development, delivery and impact of therapeutics and vaccines. So this module, Module 4, is concerned with the important topic of vaccines and therapeutics, and in particular, I emphasise the systems and processes for their research, manufacture, trialling, safety, authorisation and delivery. As is very well known, on the 2nd of December 2020, following a recommendation from the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the UK regulator, and on advice from the Commission on Human Medicines, the CHM, and its expert working groups, a UK minister licensed the first COVID-19 vaccine for use in the United Kingdom. This was the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, brand name Comirnaty. This vaccine was authorised for use under the temporary authorisation procedure provided for by what is known as Regulation 174 of the Human Medicines Regulations 2012. This is a UK legal provision that permits authorisation on a temporary basis, as opposed to the direct application of EU law, which was then applicable in the United Kingdom and, in fact, which continued to apply until 11 p.m. on the night of the 31st of December 2020 at the end of the transition period. I need to start this opening by saying something about the trial and authorisation process that led to that decision, because that process applies in general terms to both vaccines and therapeutics. As will be examined in the course of this module, but now in summary outline only, companies which develop new medicines, including vaccines, first need to obtain an authorisation to run clinical trials in the United Kingdom. Authorisation to use the medicine clinically can then only be granted following the successful completion of a rigorous preclinical and clinical trial process. Clinical trials are conducted via a series of phases. phases 1, 2, and 3, to test the safety and effectiveness of the trial medicine. In the case of the United Kingdom COVID-19 vaccines, the phase 3 trials were well-powered trials of between 20 or so thousand to 43 or so thousand human volunteers, equivalent, in fact, to other large-scale clinical trials required for the licensing of other vaccines. The manufacturer then submits to the MHRA the results of those clinical trials, as well as data on the safety, quality, and effectiveness of the medicine, including data that is available both for and against the product. All safety data for the medicine must be provided, regardless of where in the world the trials took place. The UK clinical trial process is also overseen through audits and visits carried out by the MHRA, and each batch of medicine is examined by the MHRA's laboratories, independently of the testing carried out by the manufacturer. During the COVID-19 pandemic, to increase efficiency and to progress the regulatory review in a shorter time, evidence in support of these authorization applications was considered in an expedited and flexible rolling review procedure by the MHRA. And in effect, this allowed the manufacturers to provide packages of data as they were generated, as opposed to waiting until the conclusion of their trials before submitting all the data in one package. The expert evidence commissioned by this inquiry is to the effect that there was no reduction in the efficacy or safety of any of the vaccines or the trials as a result of this process. As with all clinical trials, the MHRA also requires the manufacturer to report what is known as any suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reaction, a SUSAR, within the clinical trials. It's an adverse event, a condition or a reaction, which is assessed to be unexpected, serious, and as having a reasonable possibility of a causal relationship with the drug being studied. Where in the case of a specific vaccine, the clinical trials were conducted globally by the manufacturer across multiple sites, but with at least one site in the United Kingdom, the MHRA required the reporting of any SUSARs occurring anywhere in the world. My lady, because clinical trials can only study a finite number of patients over a defined period, rare or very rare adverse reactions are unlikely to be identified by those trials. The serious conditions for which there now exists published evidence suggesting an association with the COVID-19 vaccine were all either very rare, that is to say between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 100,000 doses, or even rarer, described in places as extremely rare, that is to say less than 1 in 100,000 doses. And a reaction or a condition that only occurs in less than 1 in 100,000 people will simply not be apparent in a clinical trial involving only 30,000 people. It will only become apparent when much higher numbers of people, for example at a population level, are being vaccinated. It is worth remembering that during the first 2 days of vaccine rollout in the United Kingdom, more people had been vaccinated than in all the clinical trials in the United Kingdom up to that point. For this reason, and because certain groups, such as those with underlying chronic conditions or those who are immunocompromised or pregnant women, did not take part in the clinical trials, a crucial part of the regulatory process is the system of post-authorization surveillance of the safety of the medicine in clinical use. Obviously, as clinical usage of the medicine expands, more and more real-world data on the safety of that medicine, in this particular case vaccine, becomes available, and this must of course be closely examined. The manufacturer is therefore legally obliged to continue to keep under review the safety of the medicine, and the MHRA and other bodies are obliged to carry out safety monitoring so that the benefit risk of that medicine can be constantly reassessed, and prescribers, patients and the public can be kept informed. Without going into the detail at this stage, manufacturers are required to submit a number of documents and a great deal of data and information to the MHRA. They provide safety surveillance data, the submission of UK as well as non-UK individual case safety reports, periodic safety update reports, risk management plans, and what is known as post-authorization safety study protocols. And at the same time, one of the major ways in which healthcare professionals and the public may be kept informed about safety is through the product information that accompanies every authorized medical product, specifying the conditions of use and details of any risk minimization measures. And there are two principal documents which relate to the provision of that information: the summary of product characteristics and the patient information leaflet. In addition, there are a number of important elements to how the MHRA operated its post-authorization surveillance system. Again, it's not necessary to set them out in detail in the opening, but these four pillars, as they were known, comprise firstly the yellow card scheme, through which the MHRA scientists and clinicians examined the process by which professionals and the public could report any suspected side effects or adverse drug reactions. And the MHRA published weekly summaries of the yellow card reporting, as well as online drug analysis profiles for the vaccines. Secondly, the MHRA examined trends and events through what is known as rapid cycle analysis. That's to say, analysing predefined events and monitoring trends to see what the reaction in the population cohorts consists of. Thirdly, there was targeted active monitoring through the yellow card vaccine monitor scheme, which entailed the sending out to a very large number of people, I think 1.5 million people in all, invitations, inviting them to allow themselves to be followed up to see whether or not they encountered any suspected adverse reactions. And then finally, they carried out a series of studies, formal epidemiological studies, involving the evaluation of electronic health records, published medical reports, and other national data sources. My lady, I set all this out immediately and at this stage because the evidence before this inquiry, particularly the evidence from the expert evidence that we've commissioned, suggests overwhelmingly that the United Kingdom operated a robust and sophisticated system for ensuring the highest levels of safety. But it will be, of course, for you to assess the accuracy of that proposition, and therein lies one of the most important purposes of this module. The overall process by which the MHRA ensured that the Pfizer vaccine, and indeed all the vaccines authorised under that regulation, Regulation 174, were effective and acceptably safe, was no different in substance to the process that would have applied had those applications been made pre-January 21 for full marketing authorisations under the then EU regulatory scheme, or after the 1st of January 21 under the English or British UK scheme that replaced it. I've said acceptably safe. What is acceptably safe? Almost no active drug, vaccine, or medical procedure is without risk. And indeed some, such as major surgery or chemotherapy, carry substantial risks. The term acceptably safe means that based on the assessment of the MHRA, the benefits or expected benefits associated with a particular product are considered to outweigh any risks associated with that product at a population level, and that the risks are acceptable in the context of the expected benefits. My lady, the public health benefit of vaccination generally is beyond argument. But the issue which arose, and it's the issue which lies at the heart of this module, was whether the MHRA properly assessed whether the benefit of a particular product, of course the vaccines, outweighed the risk. In the context of those vaccines, the question was whether being vaccinated carried fewer risks than being unvaccinated, where there was a high chance of acquiring COVID and where COVID was a life-threatening disease for many. I should also emphasize that this approach is also broadly similar to that applied by overseas regulators, such as the European Medicines Agency and the US Food and Drug Administration. Indeed, many of the most important thresholds for aspects of this regulatory process, such as the need for randomized controlled trials and ascertaining what level of vaccine efficacy would be considered acceptable, were in fact agreed with other major national regulators in other countries. And so, on the 8th of December, the UK launched its COVID-19 vaccination delivery programme, and 91-year-old Margaret Keenan became the first person in the world to receive a COVID-19 vaccination outside the setting of a clinical trial. By December 2023, 3 years later, many more vaccines had been authorised by the UK Minister, formerly known as the Licensing Minister, on the recommendation of the MHRA. But the 3 vaccines that were actually deployed in the United Kingdom during the time period being looked at by this module were as follows. First, there was the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, Comirnaty, to which I've already referred, which was given to Margaret Keenan. My lady, this vaccine is known as a messenger RNA, a ribonucleic acid vaccine. A messenger RNA vaccine is one that carries, hence the name messenger, an RNA molecule, as opposed to part of a piece of bacteria or a virus. And this molecule causes cells in the body to produce protein that corresponds to the spike protein on the outer membrane of the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. That spike protein having been produced, the body then produces antibodies to attack it, thereby giving the body protection against the virus in the event of infection. At the time of the authorization decision for Pfizer-BioNTech, clinical safety data was available from more than 43,000 trial participants, of which more than 19,000 had been followed up for at least 2 months post-second dose. Those Pfizer-BioNTech trials took place in the United States, in Europe, Turkey, South Africa, and South America. Approximately 42% of those global participants and 30% of the US participants had racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds. The trials reported no SUSARs. The SUSARs are the reports that I described earlier of serious, unexpected, suspected adverse reactions. As you know, authorization for use in 12 to 15-year-olds was subsequently granted, and after that, in December 21 and then in December 22, authorization was granted for the use of smaller doses for 5 to 11-year-olds and then 6 months to 4-year-olds. The United Kingdom government ordered a very large number of doses in July 2020 by way of advance purchase, 40 million doses in all, and many more millions subsequently for primary and booster campaigns. The second vaccine is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, brand named Vaxzevria. This, my lady, is a vaccine known as an adenoviral vector vaccine. And I've described the science and the technology underpinning these vaccines because it forms an important part of the evidence that you'll hear in due course about the technological consequences or observations that might be drawn from their use. The technology involves using another virus from the family of viruses known as an adenovirus to carry the vaccine, hence the name vector. The adenovirus is modified, however, so it itself cannot cause infection. It's then modified so that when it enters the body, it can enter the body's cells carrying the vaccine contents, the vaccine parcel. That parcel contains, again, the genetic blueprint of the spike protein from the coronavirus target, which the cell then starts to make. And then again, as with the mRNA, the body's immune system is triggered to make antibodies to attack the spike protein. And that technology has been around for a while. It's used in vaccines for flu, the Zika virus, the tropical disease chikungunya, as well as the Middle East respiratory syndrome MERS, and has since been approved in the United Kingdom for an Ebola vaccine. That Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was evaluated in clinical trials internationally and in the United Kingdom, involving more than 23,000 participants. The MHRA approved pre-authorization clinical trials to be conducted in the United Kingdom in March 2020 for phase 1 and 2, and then for phases 2 and 3 in May. The AstraZeneca trials took place in the United Kingdom, in Brazil and South Africa. And in relation to diversity of those trials, the non-white ratio in the UK phase 3 trial was 7.1%, reflective in very general terms of the ethnic makeup of this country. In Brazil, 31.4%, and in South Africa, 87%. That vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, was authorised by the MHRA on the 30th of December 2020, again under Regulation 174, and for use in patients aged 18 and older. It was first deployed, as you will recall, on the 4th of January 2021. But no authority, for reasons we'll come to, was later given for younger age groups. In May 2020, by way of advance purchase, 100 million doses were ordered by the United Kingdom government. Third, but by no means least, and last, there is the Moderna vaccine, brand name Spikevax. It is, like the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, a messenger RNA vaccine. It was evaluated in clinical trials involving more than 30,000 participants. There were no pre-authorization trials in the United Kingdom, but no SUSARs were in any event reported from any of the overseas clinical trials. It was authorized on the 8th of January 2021 for use in patients aged 18 and older. Insofar as the ordering was concerned, some 17 million doses were ordered in November 20, and a further 60 million were subsequently ordered. It was deployed in April 21, and its authorization was subsequently extended for younger age groups in August 21 for 12 to 17-year-olds, April 22 for 6 to 11-year-olds, and in May 23 for those aged 6 months to 5 years old. My lady, those three vaccines are what I've called the UK COVID-19 vaccines. But there were, as I've said, other vaccines which are required to be mentioned. Although the Novavax and the Sanofi GSK vaccines received conditional marketing authorizations in February 22 and December 22 respectively, they weren't actually deployed during the time scope of this module, which ends in its review in June 22. Similarly, although doses were ordered of the Janssen vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, in August 2020, and it too received a conditional marketing authorization in May 21, it also was not in fact deployed in the United Kingdom during the relevant period. And so, my lady, for those reasons, those three vaccines are not the subject of specific scrutiny in the course of this module. But since, insofar as they're concerned, the focus of this module is on the systems and processes for the development, research, manufacture, authorization, safety, and so on of vaccines, little turns on the fact that we're not looking at those three in particular. We are, however, looking at the process surrounding the Valneva vaccine, 60 million doses of which were ordered in September 2020, because its contract with the UK government was terminated in September 21. And because the circumstances surrounding that termination are not without controversy, it'll be looked at. My lady, the figures are illuminating. The Pfizer-BioNTech, Oxford AstraZeneca and Moderna vaccines made up the vast proportion of vaccinations administered in the United Kingdom during the pandemic. By the time the Vaccine Task Force closed its operations in September 22, over 150 million doses of those three vaccines had been used in the United Kingdom. The number of COVID-19 doses given to people of all ages was approximately, as at September 22, 131 million in England, over 13 million in Scotland, roughly 7.7 million in Wales, and almost 4 million doses in Northern Ireland. We have a slide, or a number of slides, but one of which shows the weekly take-up for each of those three vaccines. Slide 3, please. And you can see there, over the general course of the pandemic up to June 2022, how doses of each vaccine were given weekly. And you can see, therefore, of course, how it is that use of particular vaccines ebbed and flowed during the passage of time. But by the end, AstraZeneca was in very little use, Pfizer was in the greatest use, followed by Moderna. The next slide, slide 4, shows the cumulative total of doses given of each vaccine between December 2020 and June 22. So again, showing that overall, many more Pfizer vaccine doses were administered by comparison to AstraZeneca and Moderna. Those three vaccines also account for amongst the most used vaccines in the world, calculated by the number of countries which have deployed them. It is of the utmost importance that I emphasize that by the particular metric of the need to protect at a population level against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the vaccine program succeeded. The JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization, estimated that the 9 cohort groups who were vaccinated in phase 1 of the program, that is to say, the priority groups comprising residents in a care home or care home workers in priority group number 1, and then a series of groups defined by age and vulnerability to morbidity and mortality thereafter, that together they constituted 99% of preventable mortality from COVID. The numbers of those vulnerable people protected by the vaccines amounts to some 27 million people in England and around about 33 million across the whole of the United Kingdom. The UK COVID vaccines delivery plan noted at the time that best practice in existing vaccination programs is 2-dose vaccination of 75% of the total population cohorts. By the end of the relevant period under consideration in this module, late June 2022, approximately 87.6% of the UK adult population had been vaccinated with 2 doses, so well above that planning assumption. Nearly 9 in 10 people in the United Kingdom aged 12 and over received 2 doses. And if we could have slide 1, please, I'd be very grateful. Slide 2 shows the percentage in each nation of over 12-year-olds who had received at least 2 doses by the 30th of June 22. In Wales, 89.8%, Scotland, 85.7%, England, 83.7%, Northern Ireland, 81.1%. Those figures differ slightly from the figures that we looked at earlier because these are calculated by reference to persons aged 12 and over as opposed to adults 18 and over. But the broad message in all these figures is of a very high take-up. In England, all the priority groups were offered vaccination by the 12th of April, in Scotland by the 7th of May, in Wales by the 4th of April, and for Northern Ireland, although there's no exact comparable data, very shortly thereafter. The breakdown by age and ethnicity of those who had 2 doses in England is at slides 5 and 6. And obviously, we will look at these figures with much closer attention in due course and in greater detail during the course of the evidence. But slide 5 shows the cumulative percentage of adults, so segregated by age, with reference to their take-up between January 21 and June 22. And as is perfectly obvious and plain, those who were older tended to have, of course, a higher degree of take-up. because they were most at risk. Slide 6 shows very broadly the age standardized percentage of adults receiving 2 vaccinations up to June 22 by ethnic group. And a great deal more will be said about these figures through the expert evidence in due course. My lady, by June 2021, Public Health England estimated that over 44,500 hospitalisations and over 14,000 deaths had been averted in older adults. Lest it be thought that that was just Public Health England's take on the matter, a World Health Organization study found that between December 20 and November 21, an estimated 22,000 deaths were directly averted through the vaccination programme in Scotland. The United Kingdom Health Security Agency further estimated in September 22 that by September 21, a year earlier, 9 months after the rollout had begun, the COVID-19 vaccines had prevented more than 23 million infections and 123,000 deaths in the United Kingdom. My lady, empirically, it is beyond argument that vaccinated people were far less likely to get COVID-19 with symptoms. They were even more unlikely to get serious COVID, to be admitted into hospital, or to die from it. Vaccinated people were also less likely, although the figures are much harder to interpret, to pass the virus to others. In mid-July 21 and late October 21, the number of COVID cases in England were broadly equivalent to the levels that had been seen in December 20 and mid-January 21. So the virus was circulating in the population at the same broad level. Yet the number of COVID-related deaths and hospitalisation cases were far lower in July 21 and October 21 than they had been for those earlier periods. The absolutely clear expert opinion of the leading pharmacoepidemiologist instructed by the inquiry, Professor Prieto Alhambra, from whom we'll of course hear in due course, is that the vaccines, those 3 COVID-19 vaccines, were entirely effective. He reaches 4 main findings. Firstly, he says the initial estimates on how well vaccines protected against COVID came from large randomized phase 3 clinical trials, which had involved tens of thousands of people. Although, of course, there were differences in location, in study population, because they involved different nationalities and different ethnicities, and in the choice of placebo, all the trials consistently showed high protection against COVID. Secondly, when the vaccine campaign started and the vaccines began to be rolled out, an increasingly number of people were vaccinated, the effectiveness of the vaccines was able to be tested in real-world conditions. And it was monitored by multiple academic groups and multiple agencies, such as the UKHSA, Public Health Scotland, Public Health Wales, Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland, and so on. Those included studies, or they included studies to establish the effectiveness of the vaccines in the general population, as well as in subgroups of people who had not been included in or who had been underrepresented in the phase 3 trials. Although precise figures varied, they did consistently show the vaccines were effective to substantially reduce the risk of symptomatic, severe, and fatal COVID in real-world conditions. Moreover, all ethnic groups benefited from vaccination, as did those populations who had been underrepresented in trials, such as clinical risk groups. Thirdly, he concludes that numerous studies were conducted to understand the impact of COVID vaccination on COVID-related and all-cause mortality. Those show without any doubt that vaccination had a substantial beneficial impact on the course of the pandemic. And lastly, he says the effect of the approved vaccines on reducing transmission was not studied in the trials, of course, and measuring transmission through observational research and modelling studies is challenging. But there is nevertheless moderate to high quality data to show that the UK COVID-19 vaccines were also effective in reducing both the likelihood of infection, that is to say that a person if vaccinated is less likely to catch the virus, as well as infectiousness, i.e. the likelihood of passing it on. In summary, the evidence suggests overwhelmingly that the UK COVID-19 vaccines successfully protected the people of the United Kingdom against a virus that was killing and liable to kill hundreds of thousands of people. Indeed, the UK has been estimated to be the country in the World Health Organization Europe region with the highest number of deaths averted due to vaccination. And of course, the success of the programme enabled the relaxation of other control measures, facilitating socio-economic recovery. My lady knows that it was, however, not a foregone conclusion that the United Kingdom, or indeed any country, would find and develop an acceptably safe and effective vaccine, especially as no one had ever made and trialled an effective vaccine for a human coronavirus before. Historically, success rates for developing vaccines against viral infectious diseases are low. There's only around a 10% probability of progressing from phase 2 trials to licensing within 10 years. And as you know, for HIV, the last pandemic with a global impact, a vaccine has still not been developed over 40 years since the virus was first identified. In the early days of the pandemic, there were believed, in fact, to be around 200 or so vaccines in early development across the world to deal with the challenge posed by coronavirus. But the chances of any one vaccine candidate being effective and safe were remote. And the Vaccine Task Force's own programme business case estimated that the likelihood of any individual vaccine being safe and effective varied between 5% at the most pessimistic scenario and 10% on the most optimistic scenario. That Vaccine Task Force met more than 80 times between April and December 2020 and secured access to a portfolio of 7 vaccines for the United Kingdom. We'll hear much more evidence in due course, including from the chair of the Vaccine Task Force, Dame Kate Bingham. But essentially, the task force succeeded, firstly because it agreed an enormous 5.2 billion programme business case with the Treasury to fund interventions. It applied a portfolio approach under which it tried to secure access to as many available vaccines as it could, and it procured at risk. That is to say, it invested in manufacturing of vaccines before data on their safety and efficacy was available. I emphasise they invested in manufacturing before that data became available. That is by no means to say that there was authority given for the vaccines to be administered before that data was available. It's important, my lady, that I emphasise also that the foundations of that success were built on decades of global research and preparation, benefiting from previous work to develop prototype vaccines for SARS-CoV-1 and MERS coronavirus, and decades of research to develop mRNA vaccines, many of which were conceived as cancer vaccines. It was also built on the United Kingdom's formidable science and clinical research infrastructure. Ultimately, that success could not have been achieved without the remarkable collaborative and collective effort of dedicated administrators and regulators, scientists and researchers, clinicians and epidemiologists, public health professionals, academics, universities, and external professionals, as well as, of course, the commercial entities that developed and manufactured the vaccines. And also, my lady, you would wish me to make mention, I know, of all those members of the public who volunteered for vaccine clinical trials in the community. And credit must also be given to the bodies and organisations, particularly the National Health and Social Care bodies, the public health agencies and local authorities, and where they were engaged, the military and charitable and voluntary and community groups who made this unprecedented population vaccination possible. So, my lady, that is the starting point for the scrutiny of vaccines. I now want to say something about non-vaccine medicines, because they were also a critical part of the response to the pandemic. And this module will be focusing on therapeutics, non-vaccine medicines, with the same degree of scrutiny as it will be focusing on vaccines. At the beginning of the pandemic, my lady knows there were no drugs and no vaccines. Patient management was symptomatic, the provision of oxygen and of necessary respiratory and other vital organ support in hospital. The benefits of therapeutics and prophylactics are obvious in the context of a pandemic. The process of discovering, developing, testing, manufacturing and distributing vaccines takes time, if it is possible at all. Drugs therefore play a vital role in prevention and treatment, particularly of the elderly, the frail and the immunocompromised, while waiting for a vaccine to be deployed. And even if a vaccine does become available, there will be people who cannot take a vaccine for medical reasons, or for whom the vaccine does not mount a sufficiently protective response. And so the drugs can be used to treat them, to treat vaccine breakthrough infections, or the unvaccinated and vulnerable groups. My lady, very briefly, there were four main types of medicine. In the context of the COVID pandemic, we'll be looking at small molecule antivirals which stop the virus from multiplying. Secondly, neutralizing monoclonal antibodies such as sotrovimab, which was approved in the second year of the pandemic. These are antibodies engineered to help block the ability of the virus to invade cells, and they help the body to recognize and destroy infected cells. The importance of those monoclonal antibodies is they can be used prophylactically in advance of infection. And they turned out to be less effective against variants of the coronavirus. Thirdly, there are anti-inflammatories. These help to treat the inflammatory complications in the body's immune system caused by COVID. The most important life-threatening complication of COVID was inflammation in the lungs, caused by the body's excessive response to the preceding viral infection. And this happened to be the main cause of hospitalization and death. Lastly, only in very general terms, there were medicines used in the treatment of complications caused by the disease, such as blood clotting. My lady, the view of the therapeutic expert instructed by the inquiry, Professor White, who's a professor of tropical medicine at the University of Oxford and at Mohidal University in Bangkok, is that in general terms, the speed of the clinical research response therapeutically in the United Kingdom in 2020 was admirable. This was due, he says, to primarily the UK's strong record in the science and in the conduct of clinical investigation and clinical research, and the fact that many government bodies and entities, the DHSC, the then Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, the government's Chief Scientific Advisor, then Sir Patrick Vallance, and the main research funding structures, such as the National Institute of Health Research and the UK Research and Innovation and its Medical Research Council, all responded very rapidly indeed. Within days of what was called an urgent public health process being announced on the 4th of February, UK researchers submitted applications for research to be set up at hospitals, in GP practices, and non-NHS settings such as schools, prisons, and care homes. That body, the National Institute of Health Research and its clinical research network, received over 1,500 applications for research. Some 100 or so studies were badged with what is known as the urgent public health process, and over 1 million participants were recruited in thousands of sites. Hundreds of candidate therapeutics were proposed in the first days and weeks of the pandemic, and I want to mention a number of bodies and entities that played a hugely important part, from the UK COVID-19 Therapeutics Advisory Panel, which considered potential COVID treatments to be proposed for nationally publicly funded clinical trials, to the Prophylaxis Oversight Group, the Nerve Tag Therapeutic Subcommittee, and the Research to Access Pathway to Investigational Drugs. All played a vital role in ensuring that research was commenced speedily and effectively. My lady, I needn't, I think, set out the detail of many of the other committees that were involved in this important process, but you will hear many references to the role of Rapid C19, the multi-agency entity which monitored emerging trial evidence and the effectiveness of therapeutics, also the Therapeutics Task Force, which was established in April 2020 and then was followed in April 21 by the Antiviral Task Force, and in April 22, the Antivirals and Therapeutics Task Force. To give you, my lady, some idea of the scale of the endeavour, over 700 new drugs were researched or explored in some shape or another. The UK government secured 5 million courses of oral antivirals to treat COVID. They were Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, and some 80% of those courses were procured after, in fact, the emergence of Omicron. But, my lady, and this is something that we'll be looking at in much greater detail, there were significant issues with the procurement of antivirals generally, and with one neutralising monoclonal antibody cocktail, Evusheld in particular, as well as some delay. Many believe that there could have been greater therapeutic procurement, which is an issue to which you will have to return in the course of the evidence. There were, in addition, real concerns about whether there were too many trials. Some were underpowered, and many of them were ultimately inconsequential. Nevertheless, in general terms, the UK stood out in the pandemic for conducting very high quality and impactful therapeutic studies. My lady, those trials and the research benefited Britain, and it benefited the whole world. One large hospital-based platform trial, a multi-centre trial because it tried a number of different therapeutics, was organised with remarkable speed. This was the UK's Phase 3 recovery trial. The acronym is for the Randomised Evaluation of COVID-19 Therapy. My lady, this trial was funded by the UK Research and Innovations Medical Research Council and the National Institute of Health Research in March 2020. It was co-led by Professor Sir Martin Landry and Professor Sir Peter Horby and supported by the University of Oxford. It recruited some 50,000 patients, ranging in age from less than 6 months to over 100 years old, 1/3 of whom were female and 1/6 of whom were Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. It spread across 195 hospital sites where patients were receiving drugs clinically. It commenced within 6 weeks of being funded and grew to become the world's largest clinical trial into treatment for COVID. A second important community trial was Panoramic. This was sponsored again by Oxford and funded by the National Institute for Health and Care Research. It recruited around 30,000 participants over around 70 sites, and it looked importantly at whether patients at home could be treated with a drug called Molnupiravir, an antiviral treatment, and also Paxlovid, which was ritonavir-boosted nirmatrelvir, and is now the most effective currently available antiviral drug against SARS. A third important UK trial was the Principal trial. This was launched in March 2020. It recruited participants online from anywhere in the United Kingdom, as well as across 1,000 GP practices, and it became the world's largest COVID-19 treatments trial for recovery in the community. My lady, I intend no discourtesy if I don't mention all the many other trials. They're no less important. They included the REMAP CAP trial, which carried out trials in over 8,000 patients at over 250 sites worldwide, and the World Health Organization's Solidarity trial, which involved 14,000 so hospitalized patients across 50 countries. The most significant results, my lady, were, however, obtained in the main from the recovery trial. And it's important that I set them out because this provides the forensic basis for the examination of why some other drugs were not tested through and then authorized in due course. The first main finding from the recovery trial was that it showed that certain repurposed drugs, which were looked at particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, because, of course, the researchers and the clinicians and the administrators and regulators looked first at those drugs which were already in existence and had been authorised for other conditions and whether they could be repurposed. So Recovery looked at whether lopinavir, in combination with another therapeutic, ritonavir, and another therapeutic, azithromycin, an antibiotic, worked against SARS. They showed, in fact, that they didn't reduce mortality in COVID patients. But even a negative outcome, of course, has a beneficial impact because it shows what isn't, therefore, worth spending time and money on pursuing. And, of course, it will drive the trial on to try to find beneficial outcomes through other therapeutics. Secondly, the Recovery trial showed that hydroxychloroquine had no beneficial effect on patients hospitalised with COVID. There were other trials, however, I emphasise, which did provide evidence that it was moderately effective at preventing symptoms, that is to say, as a prophylactic. And you'll hear evidence about hydroxychloroquine and its research and development, because that is a somewhat contentious issue. Thirdly, the Recovery trial produced evidence about the remarkable impact of dexamethasone. My lady, this is a cheap and readily available corticosteroid. It was the first drug to improve survival in COVID because it reduced deaths by about 1/3 in ventilated patients and by 1/5 in other patients receiving oxygen only. My lady, following the publication of the clinical trial results in June 2020, the Chief Medical Officer, then Professor Sir Chris Whitty, issued what is known as a COVID-19 therapeutic alert, advising immediate use in the United Kingdom. A number of studies estimate that dexamethasone saved the lives of around 22,000 patients in the United Kingdom and globally around 1 million lives by March 2021. It was the single most important therapeutic research result of the entire pandemic. Fourthly, Recovery was concerned with an anti-inflammatory intravenous drug which is used to treat rheumatoid arthritis called tocilizumab. This was the second therapeutic that had its treatment, or the treatment with it, added to the authorization by the MHRA. Fifthly, the Recovery trial showed that the monoclonal antibody cocktail, that is to say, the combination of two monoclonal antibodies, casirivimab and indevimab, reduced the relative risk of mortality by 20% in hospitalized patients with COVID who'd not yet mounted an antibody response of their own. That cocktail is known as Ronapreve, which was developed by Regeneron and Roche. It also looked at baricitinib, which is an anti-inflammatory treatment licensed for use in rheumatoid arthritis, which had considerable beneficial impact because it reduced the risk of death when given to hospitalized patients. And it also looked, finally, at natural antibodies obtained from the plasma of convalescent patients. In the event, the MHRA authorised the supply of 6 new medicines for COVID treatment in the United Kingdom. Remdesivir, Veklury, which was the therapeutic which was looked at primarily by the WHO Solidarity trial. They authorised the use of casirivimab and indevimab, the Ronapreve cocktail, although that was subsequently withdrawn from use because it turned out eventually not to be quite so effective against Omicron, or not effective against Omicron. Thirdly, they authorised molnupiravir, which was a therapeutic which was the subject of advanced purchase. They also authorised sotrovimab, again the subject of an advanced purchase, and they authorised the Paxlovid therapeutic, nirmatrelvir and ritonavir. And finally, they authorised the new medicine Evusheld, to which I'll return in a moment and about which you'll hear a great deal of evidence, which is the combination of tixagevimab and silgavimab as a pre-exposure prophylactic. My lady, 2 previously authorised therapeutics, that is to say, 2 drugs which are already authorised for other use, were also approved by the MHRA, and they were dexamethasone, which was the repurposed drug to which I've already referred, the outcome of the recovery trial, and also tocilizumab, Roactemra, which was the result of the REMAP CAP trial. My lady, I've emphasised that detail and I've set it out there because it means that we needn't spend any time at all in the course of the evidence setting out what the outcome was forensically in terms of the trialling and the authorisation process. Those are the drugs that were repurposed or authorised afresh. My lady, the therapeutics programme was not, of course, and how could it ever have been, an unalloyed success. There were very real problems with, in particular, the coordination and management of some of the trial phases, phase 2, and many have suggested that there was insufficient focus on the pursuit of antivirals and prophylactic drugs, and in particular, whether certain particular medicines should have been procured prophylactically or for treatment. And that is where we become engaged in the issue of Evusheld. But again, like the vaccine programme, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the therapeutic programme was a success. My lady, is that a convenient moment?
Certainly, if it's convenient for you, Mr. Keith. It is now coming up for. I shall return at 11:15.
All rise.
Before you recommence, Mr. Keith, I just want to say about the impact film. I am hopeful, not entirely confident, but hopeful that we'll be able to play it at the close of your submissions. So before the core participants make their submissions.
Thank you very much, my lady. So, my lady, given the many successes of both the vaccine and therapeutics programmes, some may immediately ask why, beyond the fact that these topics are mandated for our examination by our terms of reference, the inquiry is inquiring into them. My lady, that question is easily answered. First, as the written submissions from the COVID-19 Bereaved Families of Justice UK group in particular put it, it is important to recognise achievements and best practice that worked, as well as why other things did not work. This is, of course, because lessons may be learned from both. Lessons can be learned as to whether the innovative ways of working utilised during the pandemic can be embedded in peacetime and replicated in future. It may also be asked whether the undoubted successes of the programmes relied, in fact, overmuch on the UK's many undoubted strengths in the scientific research, development and regulatory fields, as opposed to having its genesis in proper resourcing, proper planning, and efficient administrative and data systems. There are a number of questions that need to be asked. Is the United Kingdom's scientific and biomedical research sector sufficiently robust and resourced to continue experimental research of vaccines and therapeutics, for example, in relation to disease X, the as yet unknown pathogen that might cause a future pandemic? To what extent do we need to focus more on prototype diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines to treat pathogenic classes of the greatest pandemic potential? Ultimately, although it's entirely a matter for my lady and the evidence has not yet, of course, been heard, you may conclude that the UK demonstrated an impressive ability to research, procure, produce and deliver multiple vaccines and therapeutics. But can the systems that we utilise for the setting up and delivery of clinical trial platforms and the large-scale platform trial process and the provision of health-related data be improved upon? There were notable data highlights in vaccines and therapeutics, such as the SIREN study involving the testing of over 45,000 healthcare workers, Public Health Scotland's EVE2 study, the SAIL databank in Wales, and the Open Safely data process in England. But it's not clear that those studies could be replicated swiftly or effectively in the future. There are also doubts, many of which are well known, as to how well embedded the UK's research and development facilities now are. In May 2020, the government announced it was further investing in the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre in Oxfordshire to broaden its capacity as a vaccine manufacturing centre. But in April 22, the board of that company took the decision to sell itself to a multinational company. We'll be hearing evidence about what the plans are for that centre. The Vaccine Task Force invested millions of pounds in the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult Centre in Braintree in Essex to fund a state-of-the-art manufacturing innovation centre. What is the state of those investments? The inquiry will also look at the current state of play concerning the deployment facility at Oxford Biomedica, as well as the government support for the Centre for Process Innovation in Darlington, and also the government's strategic partnership with Moderna and the building of the new mRNA research facility at Harwell and AstraZeneca's investment in its own manufacturing site in Speke in Liverpool. My lady knows that very recently the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee wrote to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster to express concerns of the UK's ability to manufacture vaccines in a future pandemic. Turning to procurement processes, how efficient and properly resourced were they? Why was it necessary to establish new structures such as the VTF and the TTF in the course of the pandemic? Were the NIHR's hibernated sleeping research contracts, which were set up after the 2009 pandemic, the right ones? Is more public-private collaboration required between scientists, industry and government? What is the nature of the UK's participation in the 100-day mission, the global initiative to better prepare the world by driving the development of new diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines? We also need to look at the liability and indemnity arrangements that were entered into by the government and the cancellation of the Valneva contract. Turning specifically to therapeutics, how effective and wide-ranging was the clinical research into therapeutic medicines and the systems for their authorization and eligibility for access, particularly antivirals and prophylactics? Were the trials sufficiently diverse? Was there proper quality data capture of protected characteristics in those trials? Pregnant women have traditionally been excluded from randomized controlled trials due to fears about drugs causing fetal abnormalities, but this left them with very little by way of evidence-based treatments. What is the position for them? To what extent was clinical research undermined, as our expert posits it may have been, by obstructive bureaucracy, overly burdensome process requirements and limited funding? Professor White, our therapeutic expert, also addresses two other important but separate issues. The issue of AstraZeneca's Evusheld, to which I've already referred. That's the cocktail of the two neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, tixagevimab and silgavimab. The government decided not to purchase it in advance of trials, and then in light of later data decided not to make a post-trials purchase either. Also, what was the position with hydroxychloroquine? Trials in the United Kingdom were paused following the publication in The Lancet of a report of an observational study that made a claim of a serious adverse effect. By the time the trials restarted, the first wave of infections had receded, and it was believed there was therefore less need for moderately effective chemoprevention. But from the standpoint of vulnerable groups who needed that drug and couldn't benefit from or receive the vaccines, the failure to proceed with Evusheld and hydroxychloroquine was obviously of the greatest importance. To the question of why, there is a second answer. It is that even more importantly, lessons can be learned for the benefit of those who are not able to benefit from the vaccination or therapeutic programs. This was for a number of different reasons, such as because they could not be vaccinated for medical reasons, or because vaccination was of markedly less benefit, for example, the immunosuppressed, or because they weren't vaccinated quickly enough, or they had no proper access to vaccination, or were not eligible for therapeutics, or because they suffered from long COVID, the condition that neither programme could completely prevent. And even more tragically, a number of people, very small in the overall scale of the vaccination programme, but of no less importance individually or to our examination, did suffer serious harm. Alongside the vast majority of the population who did have access to the beneficial effects of vaccines, A severe price was paid, unfortunately, by some individuals. Those side effects may be encountered in any medicine, but serious side effects, whilst very rare, are nevertheless significant and debilitating. I must emphasise the rarity, more often the extreme rarity, of the serious adverse effects that were suffered, and the fact that the figures demonstrate beyond any doubt that the life-saving benefits of the UK COVID-19 vaccines vastly outweighed the very rare risk of a serious side effect. Nevertheless, my lady, they did occur, and for those who did suffer serious side effects, and even worse, for the very small number of people whose loved ones died as a result, it was, of course, a complete tragedy, and nothing that is said about the rarity of those terrible consequences can be taken or should be taken to diminish that loss. It's important I emphasise that you have expressly ensured, for a number of reasons, that the general issue of vaccine injury must be examined by this inquiry. It is why you gave a number of representative groups core participant status. Let me seek to explain why. It is in principle right that a public inquiry examining matters of public interest and public harm should include those who were harmed by the vaccines through no fault of their own, and where their individual vaccination was carried out in furtherance not just of their own good, but also that of the wider public. Through the giving to that group of core participant status, the inquiry therefore acknowledges the experiences of those who have suffered and hopes that their involvement in this inquiry process will assist in countering the stigmatisation they have undoubtedly also had to bear. Wider than that, my lady, the long recognised fact that vaccines can very rarely have serious side effects is also intimately bound up with the issue of public confidence in vaccines. For vaccines to have their true curative effect, and there is a massive public interest in the maintenance of proper vaccination and immunisation programmes, populations must take them up. It would obviously be damaging to uptake if any belief were to take hold and were to be allowed to take hold that in the unhappy and very rare occurrence of vaccine injury, the state has forgotten those who suffered. So turning to the third issue of safety, no proper inquiry into the development and use of vaccines and therapeutics could possibly dispense with the obligation to ensure that critical aspects of the safety systems worked properly and were effective. So we will scrutinise the diversity and rigour of the pre-authorisation clinical trials, as well as the post-authorisation studies. How effective were the systems for monitoring safety signals, in particular the yellow card process and the system of post-authorisation safety studies? Was safety compromised at all by the virtue of the MHRA's rolling review? How clear was official guidance and the communication of potential adverse effects? The inquiry intends to call Professor Stephen Evans, whose many distinguished qualifications and posts include being Honorary Professor of Medical Statistics, Professor of Pharmacoepidemiology, and Emeritus Professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Important issues that he will address in evidence include whether the clinical trials in the United Kingdom were done to the usual high standards and sufficiently extensive, why the Regulation 174 legal process was adopted, whether the skill and degree of scrutiny exercised by the MHRA was appropriate, and whether there was any diminution in the level of safety oversight or regulation by virtue of the fact that there was a rolling review. He'll look at diversity of the clinical trials, the nature and effect of the post-marketing surveillance, the effectiveness of the system for informing people about suspected adverse events, and also whether the departure from the EU EMA data system and the EU database Vigilance adversely affected the United Kingdom's scrutiny. The fourth reason why this module is necessary relates to the fact that in relation to the issue of vaccination take-up, the overall figures for vaccination in fact hid notable problems. Disparities between population groups were profound, with lower uptake recorded in particular among people from minority ethnic backgrounds and migrant and gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. Ethnic minority groups in England in particular had lower age standardised rates of vaccination coverage compared with the white British population. By April 21, just 65.6% of black African people aged over 80 were vaccinated in England, compared to 97.4% of white British people. Given that being 80 or more constituted the second priority group, you'll recall, due to the severity of the risk of serious illness or mortality, that disparity is a matter of major public health concern. By April 2021, 62.2% of all adults, those aged 18 or over, of black African ethnicities had been vaccinated, compared to 93.2% of white British and 87% of people of Indian ethnicities. The level of coverage broadly across black African ethnicities did not reach 75% until June 22. Rates of coverage were also lower in the most deprived areas of the United Kingdom. The difference between the percentage of adults aged 18 or more in the least and the most deprived areas who'd received 2 doses was particularly sharp in England. Looking at geographical spread, the number of adults who'd received 2 doses was lowest in London in all age groups by June 22. Uptake among child cohorts was also lower in London than the rest of England, and there was consistent under-vaccination. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI, advised, as you will recall, that the first priority for the vaccination programme had to be the prevention of mortality through that age-focused approach and the protection of health and social care systems, with secondary priorities then focusing upon the vaccination of those at increased risk of hospitalisation through stratified age cohorts. So a number of questions arise for consideration in relation to that prioritisation. Was the process through which those decisions were made effective? Was the prioritisation right? Were decisions clearly communicated? 9 priority groups were identified, and the JCVI estimated that taken together, they represented, as I've said, around 99% preventable mortality. But what was the process for deciding on eligibility for those cohorts, and how workable was that system? Did it work, in particular for unpaid carers, disabled people, especially learning disabled people, the clinically vulnerable, pregnant and breastfeeding women and children? How effective were the devolved delivery and rollout procedures in each of the 4 nations? How well were the well-known barriers to take-up addressed, particularly amongst ethnic minority, disabled, migrant and gypsy, Roma and traveller communities? We've been greatly assisted by the written representations from the core participant groups. They largely acknowledge that some measures were implemented, but they maintain that they were either delayed or superficial or overly generic, and often not specific to the needs and often the unique barriers to vaccine uptake that their clients face. Bluntly, they say the measures adopted in each nation failed to address the systemic and root causes of the barriers that their clients acutely experienced when trying to get access to vaccines and therapeutics. The Disabled People's Organisation suggests there was no dedicated focus on disability. The JCVI and the UK Government's Vaccination Equalities Committee had no dedicated focus on disability by comparison to the Vaccine Equity Committee established in Wales. Pregnant women were another group which had needs that were not, it is said, sufficiently met. Changing government advice led to confusion amongst those who were pregnant or those who were considering pregnancy about whether they should take the vaccine. And it wasn't until April 21 that the government offered the vaccine to all pregnant women and were able to confirm its safety. My lady, the inquiry has commissioned, as you know, an extremely comprehensive report from Dr. Ben Castan-de-Bush, Assistant Professor in Public Health and Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Dr. Tracy Chandler, Associate Professor of Public Health Evaluation, again at the LSHTM. Their report on vaccine delivery and disparities in coverage gives an overview of the vaccine prioritisation and rollout processes across the United Kingdom, including the key characteristics of procedures that were adopted. My lady, there is no need for me to attempt to summarise what they say in their report, and indeed there will be no need to call evidence about this because they provide, in a readily accessible format, a summary of the coverage across the entirety of the United Kingdom and each of the 4 nations. They provide the figures for coverage broken down by age, sex, ethnicity, geographic region, socioeconomic status, coverage amongst health and social care workers, coverage in Black and Black Caribbean communities, disabled people's organisations and so on. And what they say is that whilst vaccine delivery was generally very successful and unprecedented in its scale, the fact remains that some groups simply did not have proper access. And they identify the common practical barriers to vaccination, such as lack of awareness through poor communication of eligibility and options for vaccination. They identify the issues of distance and accessibility, cost, and pre-existing inequalities and past experience of racism, which have led people from ethnic minority groups in particular to have a lack of trust in the NHS and the government. The evidence before you is clear that the stark disparities of COVID coverage, which is what they were, amongst minority ethnic groups were rooted in inequality rather than difference, that is to say, because there were different clinical aspects to those groups. Access barriers rather than refusal was obviously the primary barrier to vaccination for many of those communities. And so the authors of the report outlined the various strategies that were deployed to address uptake amongst, in particular, ethnic minority backgrounds. It's obvious that significant efforts to mitigate disparities were made, and the authors refer to the work done by the JCVI, by SAGE, by the establishment of a Vaccine Equalities Committee in England, a Vaccine Equity Committee in Wales, a Vaccine Equalities and Inclusion Team in the Vaccinations Directorate in Scotland, and a COVID-19 Vaccine Low Uptake Working Group in Northern Ireland. You'll also be told about the evidence and reminded of the evidence, because you'll recall from Module 2, we looked at these reports. The reports from the Race Disparity Unit in the Cabinet Office, which produced 4 quarterly reports which investigated and addressed disparities. But what the evidence appears to show is that notwithstanding all these efforts, issues of trust and misinformation remain for some populations, and disparities across the United Kingdom persisted. Moreover, those became increasingly apparent across all the nations as delivery progressed through the descending priority groups. So their view is that whilst pandemics differ in their epidemiological risk, the vaccination programme in the United Kingdom for COVID offers profound learning for future preparedness. And they make a number of recommendations, too many for me to summarise in my opening, but they focus on the need to strengthen the routine immunisation deployment systems. Key to this, they say, is closing gaps in routine programme delivery. They say much more must be done to address more aggressively barriers to access, to engage proactively with underserved communities, and by training healthcare providers to confidently recommend vaccination. They also say that national communication campaigns had not prepared the ground for vaccine hesitancy. Minority communities with entrenched feelings of neglect and disenfranchisement remained unlikely to engage, and more steps should have been taken to deal with them and to prepare them for rollout. Thirdly, they say that health partners simply can't expect to see high coverage by acting only during a public health emergency. Long-running and entrenched inequalities need to be tackled. There also needs to be a better process of consultation through the setting up of a vaccine equity task force in each nation. There needs to be better identification of priority risk groups, for example, people with conditions that aren't recorded in GP's notes and unpaid carers. There needs to be a learning disability register in all 4 nations that is comprehensive. They also address issues concerning whether or not there should be an expanded vaccination force, consisting perhaps of health visitors, and whether the next pandemic may place children at greater risk. They focus also on how each UK nation produced and managed its own vaccine coverage data, but how there were differences in how data was approached. They recommend a better comparison of figures across all 4 nations and the possibility of integrating or coordinating data management systems. And my lady, that then leads on to the general topic of vaccine hesitancy, which is the further reason why this module is mandated to investigate into the topic of vaccines and therapeutics. The inquiry must examine what more can be done to instill vaccine confidence and to overcome barriers to vaccine uptake, structural inequality of access, and the impact of misinformation. On this topic, the inquiry is instructed the preparation of an expert report by a team of authors led by Professor Heidi Larson, Professor of Anthropology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and greatly assisted by Alexandra de Figueiredo, Assistant Professor in the Department of Infectious Disease Epidemiology. Her view, Professor Larson's view, is that vaccination in the United Kingdom in the decades preceding the pandemic revealed a largely positive picture for routine immunisation, despite the two notable vaccine controversies concerning the pertussis vaccine and MMR. However, there's been a general decline in routine childhood immunisation levels, particularly in London. And Professor Larson and her co-authors are clear that vaccine hesitancy is brought about by a number of complex factors: socio-cultural and political influences, trust and distrust, past experiences of vaccines, understanding and perceptions of risk and benefits, societal norms, and practical barriers. And they say that those barriers include obvious matters such as information and language barriers, a lack of familiarity with the UK's health system, financial concerns, but also an understanding or a perception that the people have been treated badly by the UK health or government systems and therefore have a large degree of mistrust in the whole vaccine process. She reports that despite an initial high level of vaccine confidence when the rollout began, from April 21, there was a gradual decline in trust in the vaccines and in the UK health systems in general. She identifies the main causes of this as follows. Firstly, the issue of inequalities. She says that the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated those inequalities. Perceived institutional or structural discrimination weighed heavily against vaccine confidence, particularly in the black community. Barriers were created by lack of information. For migrants, there were additional barriers to accessing vaccines due to what are called hostile environment policies. And notably, those who felt disconnected were then more likely to rely upon the word of mouth or social media, which then led, through poor understanding or translation, to heightened exposure to misinformation, thereby fueling, in a circular way, further mistrust and hesitancy. My lady, it is obvious that a number of false narratives emerged throughout the pandemic, ranging from tropes concerning the effectiveness of vaccines, their chemical constitutions, certain side effects, to more grandiose claims that vaccine-related deaths were being concealed, or that vaccines could alter one's DNA, or that COVID-19 itself was deliberately caused as a pretext for mass vaccination. It's not necessary to inquire into why such false narratives were created and promoted, although Professor Larson posits some causes. But it is obvious that this was contributed to by low trust in the government, in scientists and medics. And that lack of trust appears to go hand in hand with high reliance on social media, high distrust about vaccine safety, and high levels of vaccine hesitancy. So, my lady, we've asked a number of organisations, the DHSC, NHS England, UK HSA, to explain how the government, the UK government, tackled COVID vaccine mis- and disinformation. And we'll be looking at the work of the Counter-Disinformation Unit and the Rapid Response Unit. What did they do to address these real problems? We've also obtained evidence from the social media platforms as to how the government interacted with them, and we'll be hearing from the Permanent Secretary at the DCMS about the processes for identifying and acting on such material. My lady, that brings me on to the subject of mandatory vaccination, which is a highly contentious topic. As you know, national guidance in the United Kingdom strongly recommends rather than requires certain vaccination for some healthcare workers with patient-facing roles, such as vaccination for hepatitis B. And so an important issue for debate is the extent to which vaccination as a requirement of deployment is required to be deployed, or whether it impermissibly undermines the autonomy of the person being vaccinated and their right to assess for themselves any associated risk. Support for mandatory vaccination in the United Kingdom was generally quite low, but the government held a public consultation exercise between April and May 21 on a proposal to make proof of vaccination a condition of employment in care homes. On the 16th of June 21, it confirmed that vaccination would be mandatory for staff working in care homes in England, with the legislation coming into effect in October. But on the 9th of July, the Welsh Government indicated that it was not consulting on this issue, stating that SAGE had advised that the uptake rate was such that no mandatory vaccination as a condition of deployment was required because the protection rates were high enough already. VCOD was not implemented in the other home nations either. It wasn't imposed in Northern Ireland, where the Department of Health instead sought engagement and support from professional bodies and unions to help encourage staff to take up the offer of vaccination. The position in Scotland was that vaccination for workers should remain voluntary, and there appears to have been particular concern about the possible impact on staff from ethnic minority backgrounds. My lady, there is considerable evidence to the effect that VCOD may not have been necessary in any event, because the levels of uptake in the care sector were at a relatively high level anyway. In addition, it's been estimated that the policy led to large numbers of staff leaving the sector. There was then a further consultation period for frontline health and social care workers. On the 9th of November 2021, the government announced that the policy for care home staff would be extended to frontline healthcare and social care workers in England. The announcement was met with concern by the unions, and a number of ethical and practical issues were raised. And in fact, the UK government's own impact assessment estimated that even with mandatory vaccination, only a minority of healthcare workers would comply, resulting in tens of thousands of healthcare workers facing unemployment or redeployment. Then, in the event, on the 1st of March, a month before the policy was due to come into place, the UK government announced it would be revoked. So Professor Larson comments upon this, as well as many other issues related to vaccine hesitancy and on the public interest and public health importance of maintaining confidence. She says maintaining and improving the infrastructure for routine immunisation is fundamental to mitigating potential harm from a future pandemic. High confidence in routine immunisation must be retained. If there is one overall central lesson to be learnt about vaccine hesitancy, it is the critical importance of trust in the government and related authorities and institutions, the NHS, and in vaccines. Because the high level of trust in the vaccination programme has since diminished, it is vital that steps are taken to reverse that decline. She makes a number of practical recommendations which will be put to her in the course of her evidence, dealing with, for example, building more robust and better tailored communication and outreach strategies, a peace-fund task force dedicated to maintaining links with community organisations, better educational initiatives, greater use of trusted community figures, better capture and coding of data, the standardisation of ethnicity and disability data collection across all 4 nations of the United Kingdom, and specialist training for health workers to improve education about vaccines and instil confidence in the population from childhood. My lady, we will also be looking in Module 4 at the topic of the Vaccine Damage Payment Act 1979 and the No-Fault Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme for which it provides. This scheme has given rise to very considerable public concern and to understandably remarkable distress on the part of those who have sought to utilise its provisions. My lady, it's obvious that having an effective vaccine payment scheme is vital. it acknowledges the impact on individuals of vaccine damage and bereavement, and a scheme which commands confidence is an important part of the system for countering vaccine hesitancy. Under the existing system, entitlement is based on being able to establish before independent medical assessors that the person has suffered severe disablement to the extent of 60% or more, and that on a balance of probabilities, the vaccine caused the injury or death alleged. My lady, these are not straightforward thresholds, and the maximum award, last revised in 2007, is £120,000, which it may be thought, not go very far in the event of lifelong injury or disablement. The matter is not free from difficulty because the scheme has a statutory foundation, excuse me, and an Act of Parliament would be required to amend it. It's also a scheme that is concerned with the payment of money from the public purse, and some claims arising from the pandemic have already been paid, with many thousands more under active consideration. It is, nevertheless, a scheme which you are mandated to examine. Mention must also be made of the Every Story Matters process, which has allowed tens of thousands of people across the United Kingdom to share their experiences of the vaccines and therapeutic programmes with this inquiry. My lady, through an online form, also through listening events and virtually held events, and through in-depth interviews and discussion groups, the Every Story Matters team have been able to gather over 34,000 stories relating to the subject matter of Module 4. Those accounts have been analysed and collated into a report, as you know, and that report's been disclosed to the core participants, and on your instructions will be published today on the inquiry's website. I need to emphasise that the Every Story Matters process is, of course, not a survey or a comparative exercise. Those accounts cannot be representative of the entire population and were not designed to be. But they nevertheless span the whole range of the list of issues to be examined in this module. And they are extremely valuable because they allow us to see what issues have been of the greatest concern to the population of the United Kingdom. And they raise issues such as public messaging, the nature of government advice for particular sectors of the population, such as disabled people, pregnant or breastfeeding women, children and young persons, and members of ethnic minorities. The role of social media, the reasons for lack of vaccine confidence, prioritisation, societal and employment pressure to vaccinate, the position of the immunosuppressed, the clinically extremely vulnerable, and lastly, and certainly not least, the issue of safety and the predicament of those who suffered harm. Those broad issues are reflective of the fact that Module 4 has, despite commentary in certain quarters, in fact, an extremely wide and ambitious scope. But there are some areas into which we cannot go. And I need to make plain that it remains beyond the scope and the ability of this inquiry to inquire, for example, into how the issues to which these questions give rise translated into real-world effects in individual cases. No inquiry, however well-resourced or lengthy, could inquire into, let alone resolve, how individuals fared as a result of the vaccination and therapeutic programmes. It would be an impossible task and one that the public does not expect and would not warrant. But I want to make plain that we have nevertheless been greatly aided by the receipt of the statements from the core participant groups representing the bereaved and vaccine injured, as well as those representing other various groups of people who were particularly adversely affected by the vaccines and therapeutic programmes, such as minority ethnic healthcare workers, disabled people and migrants, as well as those who believe that the vaccine programme did not go far enough and did not bring them the succour and the help to which they were otherwise, of course, entitled. All those witnesses will give evidence, as in earlier modules, of their own experiences, give a summary of the issues and matters that impacted their group members, and recount their dealings with government and appropriate bodies. Those accounts are deeply informative as to where the processes and systems may not have worked and where they may require improvement. Another vital area in terms of identifying, but it's not a vital area, but it's not an area that this inquiry can go into as it's outside scope. But we cannot make determinations as to whether a specific vaccine is or is not safe in absolute terms, nor can we determine matters of causation in specific cases of injury. In other words, this inquiry cannot reach an empirical view on whether pharmacoepidemiologically any of the conditions which undoubtedly have come to be believed to be associated with the UK vaccines were in fact caused by them, let alone whether they were so caused in an individual case. It is obvious, and it's well known, that it is very difficult to determine whether a serious condition that emerges in the days or weeks following vaccination was caused by the vaccine as opposed to the COVID virus itself, or was entirely coincidental. Lastly, identifying precise risks or safety margins of specific vaccines and therapeutics would be an impossible task. It would take years and engage the inquiry in highly complex and disputed scientific analysis that it is ill-equipped to carry out. But in any event, milady, you may think that the exercise of pronouncing the last word on the commerciality or efficacy and safety of specific vaccines may serve little purpose. Who is to say whether those vaccines will be of any use in a future, perhaps a non-coronavirus pandemic? It's for all those reasons that the evidence will focus on the systems and processes concerned with safety. But you have directed that an expert team of pharmacoepidemiologists led by Professor Prieto Alhambra carry out a most important task. What he and his team have sought to do is to consider, in fact, the main serious adverse events which were observed during the vaccine rollout and to which the UK regulatory agencies responded in a variety of ways, and carry out a comprehensive review of all the most relevant scientific and medical literature in order to be able to tell the inquiry whether that material at least suggests an association between the conditions which have been identified by the core participant groups and one or more of the vaccines. They consulted hundreds of published and available reports. The list, and we'll just have it up on the screen, of the conditions which they've looked at is in the expert report at page 3. You will see at the bottom quarter of the page the particular serious adverse events to which they've paid regard and which they've researched, from myocarditis, pericarditis, blood clots, Guillain-Barré syndrome, Bell's palsy, transverse myelitis, thrombocytopenia, TTS that is, and over the page, ADEM and anaphylaxis. The team of experts has more specifically considered the quality of the evidence that suggests an association between those serious adverse events and one or more of the vaccines. And what they've done is they've asked themselves whether there is good evidence to support an association so that the true position may be known. Also, where there is little or poor evidence to suggest an association, whether further search or analysis is required. Those experts have looked at the details of the frequency or rarity of the event, whether in fact the evidence suggests that it may be caused by COVID itself, or whether it appears to have been coincidental, and therefore whether it is COVID, not the vaccines, which appears to pose the greater risk. I emphasize that they must necessarily be limited to looking at what the existing material appears to demonstrate, because they cannot, and nor can you, reach a determined view on what pharmacoepidemiologically the position is in reality. But this way, the inquiry and the public will know, with respect to each of these conditions, whether there appears to be a genuine issue and what the scale of the problem is, and that will provide a forensic foundation for your recommendations. Professor Prieto Alhambra has also looked at the long list of conditions and health outcomes revealed across the entirety of the core participant group statements, and he's considered, on a high-level literature review, the degree of quality of the evidence and the reports which might suggest or might not suggest an association. That list is at page 56 of his report, INQ 474703, paragraph 5.119. You will see the very long list of conditions to which he and his team have had regard. If we could take that down, please. Many of those conditions are very rare or appear to have had multiple contributing causes, which makes it challenging to investigate them for causality. Professor Prieto Alhambra was able, however, to find some material to suggest that some of those conditions simply do not establish an association with vaccines. But in respect of other conditions, there is some material which may warrant further inquiry. My lady, reverting to the identification of areas into which this module cannot go, although the inquiry will examine the nature and efficacy of the regulatory regime, the considerations that underpin decision-making, the operation of the post-approval monitoring system, it cannot examine the scientific analysis that underpinned the data upon which authorization was granted. Also, we can neither call orally nor scrutinize in the course of this 3-week hearing more than a proportion of the witnesses whose statements you have obtained. About 170 witness statements have been procured, along with 18,000 or so documents. But such a course is, of course, not necessary. The hearing is only one part of the inquiry's work. For the purpose of drafting the report and recommendations, all of that large body of material will, of course, be considered by you and taken into account. The hearing is, in truth, only part of the forensic iceberg, and it must focus on the most important matters. We will not be spending time traversing every area identified on the list of issues or on recreating forensically what actually took place between January 2020 and June 22, let alone describing each of the bodies and entities that played their valuable roles in this complex procedure. The hearing must focus on identifying the most significant systemic features that worked or which did not work, and thereby identify what needs to be embedded and what needs to be improved. I need also say that the Module 4 legal team has gone through every single one of the Rule 9 statements from all 12 of the impacted core participant groups, amounting in fact to over 1,000 pages of descriptions of events. We've noted the many hundreds of questions, issues and concerns that have been raised, and we have deliberately checked that all those points that lie within the proper scope of this module will be addressed one way or the other by the written material, by the oral evidence, or through the Rule 10 questioning, which you have permitted through the core participant groups. Finally, there's a final point to be made by way of introduction concerning the fact that this is a UK module. The module will, of course, examine the position in all 4 nations, but that doesn't mean that every issue that arises can or needs to be looked at through a national lens. Procurement of medicines is usually a devolved competency under current devolution arrangements, meaning Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland buy their own medical supplies, such as vaccines for seasonal flu. But in respect of COVID, the UK government and the devolved administrations reached agreement that in the pandemic, the Vaccine Task Force would act on behalf of all 4 nations in pursuit of a vaccine. A number of the activities undertaken by the Vaccine Task Force, the Antivirals Task Force and the Antivirals and Therapeutics Task Force were conducted on behalf of the whole United Kingdom, and that of course included procurement, but also organised by the UK bodies on behalf of all 4 nations, and then applied jointly or through agreed adoption by the devolved administrations, were the support and funding of research, the authorisation of clinical trials, regulations, safety monitoring, eligibility for and prioritisation of vaccines and therapeutics. And so that is why, my lady, many of those issues can only be looked at through witnesses who necessarily played their part in the United Kingdom government. By contrast, public communication and messaging, delivery and rollout were matters for each devolved administration. And that is why we're deliberately calling, in respect of each of the devolved administrations, the official or the senior responsible owner responsible for the COVID-19 vaccination programme in each country. So, my lady, that I hope gives some explanation of why we've gone about the undoubtedly complex forensic task that we have before us in the way that we have. My lady, that concludes my opening. My lady, as you said earlier, we can now turn to the playing, I believe, of the video. May I have your permission to say one word about it before we hear it? I think in the public interest, it's important that I seek to emphasise that the references in this video to the obvious and well-known fact that in very rare cases vaccination has serious side effects, as indeed do all medicines, must not be used as a platform to seek to undermine the vital public health role that vaccination plays in keeping people safe from disease, or to try to seek to argue that at a population level, vaccination is not overwhelmingly beneficial. My lady, I have, of course, just been told that, in fact, we're not ready.
No, we are ready now.
Oh, no, we are ready. We are ready.
It has been changing. I am told, I hope I can say with some confidence, that we have now done what we can to edit the impact film in the time available, and we shall be playing it shortly. I understand there may be those who feel it does not fairly reflect the experience of the vaccinated members of the UK population as a whole, and I understand those concerns. It consists of accounts from a number of people who were affected by the vaccination programme and the pandemic, including those who suffered the rare and very rare side effects to which Mr. Keith has mentioned. I wish to emphasise three things. First, the film is not evidence. Second, it is not intended to be representative of the experience of the vaccinated population of the United Kingdom. And third, it does not reflect my views. I will reach my findings on the evidence, and the evidence will explore in detail the overall benefits of the vaccination programme, as well as any problems it faced or it created. So the film lasts about 15 minutes now. It explores physical and mental health, bereavement and suicide. Anyone who wishes not to see it should leave the hearing room now, or if they are following online, please press pause. No one seems to wish to leave the hearing room, so could we please play the video and keep our fingers crossed the audio is working.
Debbie was asked to shield right from the get-go. We were very, very cautious. As time went on, around about July, she got told that she could stop shielding in August. In September, just heard really, really bad coughing, and it was Debbie. I phoned NHS 24. They arranged for an ambulance to come, and the paramedic came and took her to hospital. She was okay for a couple of days, and the Sunday she took a really, really bad turn for the worst. She fought for 3 weeks trying to save her life, but at the end it became too much for her, and she passed away on October 18th, 2020. It's like Sundays opened me up, took a part out of me, and sewed me back up again. And no matter what you do, it'll never be the same again.
I lost my brother in the pandemic in January 2021. After Christmas, he developed COVID and he lived on his own in a flat. We didn't hear from my brother for a few days. I drove and I got to the flat and I went into the flat. It was silent. I went to his bedroom. I couldn't open the door. I shouted his name. I got no response. So I came downstairs. I was on my own. The police came and they told me he was dead in his bed on his own. And then we had to have a funeral to which only 15 people were allowed to actually be there. People matter. People who have died in this pandemic were brothers, sisters, husbands, fathers, and we who have to live without them, it's very hard for us.
My daddy contracted COVID and he ended up in the hospital on a ventilator for 6 weeks. And that morning, the 13th of December 2020, they rang me, it was a Sunday morning, and they just said Daddy had a real bad night and they thought it was time to get the family together. And the doctor was saying the last thing that goes is hearing. So we could just hear us all saying, goodbye, Daddy, we love you. It's absolutely horrible. He died alone, which nobody should have to do. Our whole family are just, to this day, absolutely devastated. It just won't go away. I actually worked in a care home at the time of my daddy's death. We were just forced to take the vaccines. I said no, I wasn't taking it. So it was the vaccine or my job, and I needed my job.
My daughter only lives about 1.5 miles away from me. When will I see her? When will I see my grandson? I was petrified about the impact on our relationship. Would he still recognize me as his gogo? I admit to having had some misgivings about the vaccine. And I also understood the uproar that people had about the vaccines from Black communities across the world. And I think that comes from the history of Black people. This vaccine was a place where that doubt was expressed to the world. However, I was actually probably one of the first in the queue. I had a pre-existing condition, which meant that some years previously, I had to be given flu jabs. So they're much more personally pragmatic, not because I thought I was necessarily persuading everyone else to do it. I am grateful that it seems to have worked. The fears I had didn't materialize. It's given us our lives back to what we had before. People's abilities to adapt and come together and try and make things work, I think is a testament for what is best in human beings.
Because I've had experience in the past with medical things that went wrong, I was quite worried about the jag. But eventually I thought, well, to see my mum, I'm going to the jag. But after I got the jag, I took terrible migraines, I was taking convulsions, I couldn't even pick up a phone. It could have been done a different way. There was no support there when anything went wrong. Well, that was from my experience anyway.
2-3 days after the booster, I started feeling a bit dizzy and unsteady. It got worse over time until one day I just passed out. The following day in the morning, I felt dizzy. I called my sister to come over and she found me unconscious in the bathroom. I was taken to hospital. It was a couple of days later when they discovered that the clot had burst on the cerebellum. When I tried to tell the doctor that I think my passing out was to do with the vaccine, and the doctor's attitude was, they've never heard of it. I don't like being felt sorry for, but when people look at me that way, it really hurts. Vaccine's been good for many people, but for those who've suffered because of it, there needs to be appropriate way to be able to address that, not to just tell you you're imagining it.
During the pandemic, I was working for a third sector organisation, working with young people and families. Some people felt they were forced to have vaccines, but I think the vaccine programme itself really took a lot of pressure off and people seeing a way out of this lockdown. Our community in general was about the vaccines. We rolled out a vaccine programme at one of the masjids, which had a massive turnout. People and the community had trust within us, and that trust then helped us promote vaccines and have rollout days in mosques throughout the district. And I think for people getting their vaccinations was their release date from prison. being able to go and engage back within communities, being able to go and travel, being able to, get on planes, being able to have some kind of freedom. The relief for people that were able to go and engage within communities once they got their vaccine was massive, and especially for those that were on their own and didn't have support mechanisms. For them, it was a huge sigh of relief, some hope, some light at the end of the tunnel.
I had the first vaccination in February 21. This triggered a life-threatening rare 1 in a million drug reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It was like chickenpox, and it covers you. And then all your skin starts to fall off. From the top of your head to the soles of your feet, you're burnt. I have had to pay for my treatment. I was encouraged to have a booster. I've got CCTV cameras, and I could see myself in the chair in the garden having a seizure. Nobody connected the seizure with the vaccine. So again, I was encouraged to have another. And I was very ill from it. That I'm now so ill, I can't see me living long enough to fully recover.
Thought I'd do the right thing, safe and effective, stop transmission, and had the vaccine. 3 weeks after having it, pains in my leg, so I couldn't drive. Straight in hospital, confirmed a blood clot in my leg. My health quickly deteriorated, seizures, collapsing. It's been a nightmare. I got no quality of life. I can't work. Everything I've built up the last 30 years is just gone. I'm struggling every day. The reactions I had, night sweats, palpitations, collapsing, seizures, are something you should go straight to A&E for. If you've had the vaccine and then you get a blood clot a couple of weeks after, more care should have been taken, not just said, oh, it's a coincidence.
It was always there in the back of your mind, is today going to be the day when I come down with it? When I actually came down with COVID the first time, quite anxious at times. We lost a colleague of mine. I remember the one night sitting on the bed thinking, will I wake up in the morning? Will I wake up in hospital? Especially knowing that one of our colleagues was ill in hospital with it at the same time. The vaccination, it made a massive difference. I caught it again, I think it must have been about a year or so later, and I was feeling fully vaccinated by then, and it was completely different. I was nowhere near as anxious the second time around.
I got my COVID vaccine, and within an hour, I was in bed. I couldn't get out of bed. I contacted my doctor. They wrote likely vaccine reaction in my notes. That was the clearest thing that was said to me, really, for 15 months. I couldn't go to work and I couldn't do my job. My doctor said to me, we've had no guidance from the Department of Health. They haven't told us what to do with people with a vaccine injury. So eventually I got in contact with a consultant neurologist. So he then diagnosed me with post-vaccination syndrome. I eventually managed to get medical redundancy in 2023, just 2 years after the vaccine. It's been an horrendous time. But there's also been these slice of people who've been affected by the very thing that was meant to help us. And to not help me or the people like me just seems so cruel.
My dad developed Guillain-Barré syndrome 2 weeks after receiving his first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. This is a rapidly progressive paralysis, and within days he was unable to move. Dad did not respond to the usual treatments, and he suffered multiple relapses. My dad spent 7 months in hospital. He had to learn to walk, eat, and talk again. So meanwhile, Dad, as a retired pharmacist, he strongly believed in the benefits of the vaccination programme, and he went on to receive his full course of COVID-19 vaccinations, despite his illness. He described his unfortunate situation as collateral damage of the COVID-19 pandemic, and he said he took one for the team. His neurology consultants, they encouraged him to apply for the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme. The VDPS claim was rejected as he was not deemed to have met the 60% disability threshold. He lost motivation to appeal against a system which he felt so monumentally was flawed. On the 31st of October 2023, at the age of 65, my lovely dad took his own life. Our family is completely, utterly heartbroken. We feel the vaccination and the rejection of the vaccine damage payment scheme are the indirect cause of Dad's death.
I am working as a COVID therapies clinician. I think a lot of the people who have got access to the antivirals do feel very reassured by it. I think they're still happy to, to take the medication because they're obviously, that's a lesser evil than the potential of getting a severe COVID infection. I do still speak to people now who have been referred, and it's the first time that they've had COVID since the start of the pandemic. Is quite incredible in many ways, but it shows the extent to which a lot of these people have shielded essentially. And for a long time, obviously that was the guidance, that they had to stay home, they had to be shielded. But so many of them have continued to shield, I think because of the fear of getting it.
I started hearing stories, especially from the ethnic minorities, stories about the vaccine not being so good or they shouldn't be taking it. So I was one of the first ones to be vaccinated. I took a video of that vaccination. I thought I should then circulate it within our groups, Asian communities, to show that I'm a doctor and I'm taking it, so please go ahead and do it. And then I realized, well, what can I do for the community and humanity? So I started volunteering every Saturday and Sunday for about 7 months, I think. And I thought, this is a pandemic of our lifetime, and I want my children to see that you have to give to community, to people, to humanity. It was hard for me because there were times when I was vaccinating my own patients who I would have spoken to a few weeks ago, giving them results and telling them, be careful, don't get COVID, and if you do, then you may not be ventilated. And then I was seeing them face to face, vaccinating them. I was really humbled by how grateful they were for everything in that difficult time. They were dealing with an extremely difficult disease, yet when they came for their vaccination, they were absolutely delighted and extremely grateful. I was very, very humble, and I thought that was very, very rewarding. I found that hesitation with the vaccine was more in the ethnic minorities, proportion-wise, compared to the non-ethnic minorities. Why is it? It's just deep-rooted. It's difficult. It's difficult to change their mindset, but it's not impossible, and we should continue to. But we need help. Vast majority of people in the NHS, ethnic communities, did take up the vaccination, but it may have a repercussion when the communities around them do not take up the vaccine. So no matter how much precaution I take, it's just not about me, it's about what's surrounding me. And if I'm Asian or I'm from the BAME community, I'm more likely after work to be surrounded by my community. But it is important to learn from this, and if we don't, then we have failed those who have been affected by COVID.
I'm extremely grateful to all those who contributed to the film. I don't think anyone left the hearing room, so I think we can probably start. I think Ms Munro, Casey, you're on your feet.
Good afternoon, my lady. My lady, before I start on my opening submissions, I know that you've been notified that there is just a short announcement that I wanted to make on behalf of our team.
Indeed.
My lady, you will recall only a few weeks ago, John Sullivan, a member of this group that I represent, gave evidence before you in Module 3. Sadly, over the course of the Christmas period, we were informed by his family that John had passed away. My lady, I'm sure you will join us in sending our deepest condolences to John's family. John was one of the people that I referred to in my closing submissions for Module 3 as speaking truth to power. He spoke eloquently, authentically, thoughtfully, fearlessly, and honestly, reminding us of the power of lived experiences and anecdotal evidence. John, along with others from our group, fought passionately for this inquiry to come into fruition, and he believed in the work that the inquiry is doing. We are extremely grateful that John was able to give his oral evidence to you in that last module. And along with his family, we hope that what you took from John's evidence, my lady, has and will assist you in formulating answers and strong recommendations. That, we say, would be a very fitting and lasting legacy to John's memory.
Thank you, Ms Monmere. I certainly join in sending my condolences. In fact, I shall be writing separately. I will never forget Mr Sullivan's evidence. It was very moving, it was very powerful, and everything else that you've said it was.
My lady, thank you very much. Thank you. My lady, then turning to this module. My lady, you will have seen our detailed written opening, and I would highlight in particular our paragraphs 4 and 5, which set out 8 questions, not an exhaustive list, which our families feel are particularly germane to this module. In the time available this morning, I'm not going to be able to address you at length on all of those, so we'll concentrate on 3 points. Those I do not mention are of equal importance, and we do not resile from those in any way. There was much to be praised about securing a vaccine in the UK, and Mr Keith King's counsel in his opening this morning has taken us through much of that. But, as with all things, the picture is rather more complex and nuanced than at first blush. There is the good, the bad, and whilst not necessarily ugly, the somewhat unsightly and troubling. And it is particularly the last 2 aspects which require closer scrutiny in this module. So my 3 topics that I want to highlight. Firstly, planning and delivery. The inquiry module 1 finding with regard to the overall state of preparedness in 2020 included the finding that there was, quote, a damaging absence of focus on the measures, interventions and infrastructure required in the event of a pandemic. Those comments equally apply to this module, we say. A central question must be, was the success due to pre-pandemic government having identified, understood and grasped the importance of vaccines and therapeutics and ensure sufficient resourcing and planning? Or was it due to the excellence of our research scientists in the laboratories and happenstance? As we say in our written opening submissions, it is vital to go beyond the headlines and properly evaluate the UK's response. The inquiry also noted in its Module 1 report that proper preparation for a pandemic costs money. Applying those principles to this module, research, development and manufacturing all require proper funding. Professor Wendy Barclay, who I'll refer to a number of times this afternoon, makes some very trenchant remarks in her statement, including, quote, the funding that supports research into new vaccines and delivery vehicles that is essential to be carried out carefully in peacetime was and remains suboptimal and fragmented. That's in her statement INQ 000474315 at paragraph 26. That must be a source of extreme concern requiring serious and urgent government intervention. The Vaccine Task Force, did that achieve its goals? The objectives were broad, securing vaccines for the UK, but also seeking to promote equitable distribution of vaccines around the world and to promote long-term resilience for the UK in dealing with future pandemics. And whilst many have been rightly praised in respect of the first aspect, with regards to the longer-term goals, the picture was rather more bleak. Again, turning to Dame Kate Bingham, she says, characterising the progress made in securing equitable access to vaccines across the world as modest and expressing the view that the UK, quote, donated too few vaccines to countries overseas. Same citation at paragraph 47.9. The Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre, VMIC, the infrastructure that never was. We invite the inquiry to scrutinise the government's actions and decision-making in respect of the VMIC. And we share, again, Dame Kate Bingham's view that the VMIC, quote, had reduced our resilience, and the sale of the VMIC, has reduced our resilience and capability to be prepared for a future pandemic and could have been used to help with the innovative side of vaccine development and bulk manufacturing. Professor Pollard also expressed the view that the VMIC could have filled some of the gaps in capability for small to medium scale production and allowed more rapid innovation in vaccine in the UK post-pandemic. That's INQ, his statement, INQ 000474-399, paragraph 28. Whilst Professor Gilbert notes that, quote, the UK had no national capability in vaccine manufacturing, which VMIC could and would have provided, INQ 000474-278, paragraph 57. These are all rather ominous and somewhat depressing observations that should give rise to urgent concerns and immediate remedial action. We ignore these at our peril. Therapeutics and antivirals. It is heartening to hear this morning that this will be prioritised in this module. This is vitally important because, of course, vaccines have not been able to prevent the spread of COVID-19 and do not fully protect against such things as long COVID, reinforcing the importance of therapeutics and antivirals. Sir Jeremy Farrar, in his statement at INQ 000496-107, says and observes, we do not have the balance right at present between investment in and development of therapeutics on the one hand and vaccines on the other. So, my lady, that clearly is a very right area to be considered in this module. Clinical trials. Again, this was identified as a key area of strength, yet in the written evidence disclosed thus far, again, some concerns have been highlighted that there remained limitations in respect of clinical trials in phase 1 and 2, see the clinical technical report, and again, calling upon Sir Jeremy Farrar's statement, he notes that our old friend, lack of data, remains a stubborn and unwelcome guest. So from that brief look at some of the aspects of planning and preparedness, it is clear that it will be imperative that the inquiry examines the narrative critically and addresses the fundamental question, where do we stand now? Professor Gilbert's statement is clear. The UK is not well prepared to produce vaccines for the next pandemic. There is no coordination and no plan. There is no national capability. We have not invested in vaccine development. The infrastructure is questionable. Both Professors Evans and Alhambra highlight the negative impact of leaving the EU. We are falling behind our European counterparts. All the research brilliance in the world will be limited without infrastructure funding and manufacturing and the ability to progress vaccine discoveries. Those eureka moments in the laboratory will need to be translated into vaccine rollouts for all the population. Point 2, the experience of the deceased. Our member, Helen Jean Rossiter, my lady, is due to give evidence, oral evidence, tomorrow, and she will tell the inquiry about the sad loss of her son, Peter. We have said before, and I reiterate again, one cannot underestimate the importance of the evidence of the bereaved and those with first-hand experience of the matters under discussion. I have here just 3 short examples that are illustrative, perhaps, of some of the issues under discussions in this module. Some people might find some of the details distressing. Conflicting messaging and vaccine rollout guidance. One of our members, Mr. and Mrs. Indigit Gurn, neither were evacuated. This couple were about to embark upon a journey to try for a third baby and, of course, asked their GP whether it would be advisable to be vaccinated. The GP recommended that they did not have the vaccine, and indeed, midwife told them to follow the GP's advice. Mr. Gurn was concerned about contracting the virus via work and decided he should be vaccinated. But as the nearest appointment could have been at least an hour and a half from home, he decided to wait. Sadly, he contracted COVID, was hospitalised. Mrs. Gurn states that she received conflicting information at the hospital, with doctors saying that he should have been given his jab. Mr. Gurn was 38 when he passed away. He was fit and healthy. He had no underlying health conditions. He left behind his wife and 2 very young children. He was unvaccinated. Secondly, access to and prioritisation of vaccines. Children. Another of our members, Sarah Meredith, her son Daniel passed away from COVID-19, aged just 7. Daniel had complex needs, and throughout the pandemic, his mother advocated for children who were vulnerable to have access to the vaccination as early as adults. She spoke to MPs and members of the House of Lords and was constantly met with the response, "Children are not adversely affected." Tragically, Daniel was exposed to COVID from his sister, who worked as a teaching assistant and cared for a child who she unknowingly, to her, had COVID. Daniel was in a children's hospital for 2 weeks and sadly passed away on the 27th of April, 2022. At that time, he had received 1 dose of the vaccine. His sister and mother are left with so many unanswered questions. And the thought, why were they not listened to? Thirdly, key workers. Prioritisations bans began with age, but what happened thereafter? By the summer of 2020, occupational risk was clearly a relevant factor. Our member Emma Renshaw's sister Helen was an essential worker for TfL at Charing Cross Station. She worked throughout the pandemic, doing her own shifts, even doing other people's. She believes she contracted the virus whilst covering a shift at Piccadilly Circus from a colleague who wasn't wearing a mask properly. She contacted her GP numerous times and attended A&E twice and was admitted on her second occasion due to difficulties in swallowing and taking fluids. She was at one point going to be discharged, and sadly she passed away on the 1st of March 2021 whilst in hospital. She was unvaccinated. She was an essential worker, but she was not eligible for the vaccine for at least a year. A rather sad postscript to her story is that Helen was a carer for her mother, who was suffering from Alzheimer's and subsequently in a care home. At the time of her passing, Helen was advised that unless she was receiving carer's allowance for looking after her mother, she was, again, not eligible to be vaccinated on the basis of being a carer of a vulnerable person, something her family now believe may not have been the correct advice. My lady, those are just 3 examples of the stories that are replicated throughout the 4 nations of the lack of prioritisation, poor communication and access to the vaccine. This cannot be allowed to continue and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Point 3, vaccine scepticism, ethnic minorities, the Roma community, economically deprived areas of the UK. Language is important, and I use the phrase vaccine scepticism for a reason. The term vaccine scepticism, suggested by FEMO in their written documents, is one that we would also adopt. Our bereaved families from Black, Asian and minority backgrounds very much resile from the use of the term vaccine hesitancy. It transfers the issue onto their shoulders. It is their hesitancy, their problem. That is not right, fair or true. Further, the term fails to acknowledge the barriers these groups face in vaccine uptake. Some of these have been addressed this morning by Mr. Keith King's counsel in his opening, and we will no doubt look at those in detail during the course of the module. But we know historically that those from Black and minority communities were more at risk of contracting COVID. The statistics were there. We've come across them in earlier modules. 34% of the people admitted in ICU in April 2020 were from BAME backgrounds. The first 10 doctors who died from COVID-19 were from BAME backgrounds, and 63% of the healthcare workers who died in June 2020 from COVID were from BAME backgrounds. So the information was there. Migrant workers, they continue to undertake work on the front line, often on 0-hour contracts or cash-in-hand jobs, living in poor and overcrowded housing. In the UK, migrant workers had a 22 higher chance of infection during the second wave of the pandemic as opposed to UK-born population. We commend to the inquiry the observations made by FEMO and on behalf of the Migrant Workers Group, and adopt and endorse their written oral submissions, and in anticipation the oral submissions that will be made by Council. It is against that backdrop that one should consider the issue of vaccine uptake. The government conflated vaccine hesitancy with low vaccine uptake under such headings as confidence, convenience and complacency. This failed to address the real barriers to vaccine uptake by ethnic minority and deprived groups. The SAGE ethnicity subgroup identified some of these barriers to vaccine uptake. They included perceptions of risk, low confidence in the vaccine, distrust, access barriers, inconvenience, socio-demographic context and lacks of endorsement, lack of vaccine offer or lack of communication from trusted providers. The SAGE ethnicity subgroup report also cautioned that the failure to understand the views, needs and barriers to vaccine uptake risk exacerbating pre-existing inequalities. That's in their report at INQ 000250215. Vaccine uptake amongst migrant communities was also affected by the hostile environment and laws and policies designed to deter and prevent migrants accessing healthcare, as well as the socio-economic barriers. And whilst the initial vaccine rollout was largely age-based, and that rationale is understandable, the fact that this approach to vaccine priority was taken resulted in significant numbers of the population from ethnic minority and migrant groups being excluded from early vaccination priority. My lady, we would commend to the inquiry the report, Not by Choice, the unequal impact of COVID-19 pandemic on disempowered ethnic minority and migrant communities, produced by the Race Equality Foundation in 2023. They noted that whilst on the one hand, the overrepresentation of BAME workers within the care sector may have benefited in a positive way in terms of they being accessing vaccine. On the other hand, ethnic minority groups were underrepresented in the care homes themselves and in the older population over 80. Amongst nursing home residents, Black, Asian and mixed ethnicities were underrepresented compared to their prevalence in the general population, while in the over 80s, only 3.2% were ethnic minorities, meaning that almost 147,000 people from ethnic minority groups were eligible for vaccination as part of the initial 4.6 million over 80s. The families considered that the government's failure to engage with and address known and pre-existing barriers to vaccine uptake among ethnic minorities and migrant groups in its pre-planning, development and rollout is consistent with structural and institutional racism, and we urge the inquiry to consider this as a systemic issue rather than placing blame on marginalised people themselves, which in itself is a manifestation of structural discrimination. We welcome the instruction of a team of experts on this and on other matters, and pausing there, it should be noted that the quality of experts instructed in the inquiry to date has always been very high, and their reports have often been comprehensive, informative and extremely persuasive. My lady, thus in conclusion, we are now starting Module 4 and will be hearing from a vast array of witnesses in the next 3 weeks. But it occurs to me that the recent discourse on social media and in Parliament concerning another inquiry, the child abuse inquiry, overseen by and the subsequent report by Professor Jay, reminds us that it's all too easy for people to forget not only the details and recommendations of inquiries, but that they happened at all. With that collective amnesia, it's then all too convenient years later when it becomes politically expedient or when a passing bandwagon needs jumping onto for people to wring their hands and declare that nothing was done and why has nothing changed. We cannot afford for that to happen to this inquiry. And perhaps these words are more directed outside of this room than to those within. Your Ladyship, the CPs in this room, CTI, STI are all working far too hard on this inquiry for it not to have a lasting legacy, and it must not fall prey to that curse of collective amnesia in years to come. For Module 4, we will have quite an array of witnesses, many of whom will not be making their first appearance before you. Our families, indeed no one in this room, wants to see a parade of politicians grandstanding and basking in the reflective glory of the research communities in this country and giving themselves a pat on the back accordingly. No one can afford to rest on laurels, particularly laurels that, quite frankly, most have no business reclining on in any event. What is required are answers and explanations as to why we are in our current position and why it is not optimum, and how, going forward, we are going to improve that effectively and expeditiously. We need to be well placed now so that we are ready for the future. My lady, those are our submissions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Munro. I'm very grateful. As you know well, but newcomers to the inquiry may not know as well, I don't need people to recite their written submissions. I'll take them all into account, and I'm grateful to you for summarising the most important aspects of
Thank you.
Thank you. I think probably, given we started again after the break at 11:15, we need to break now. I shall return at 1:45. All rise.